Mr. and Mrs. Robert Haney. Number 10, Mark Florak. Number 83, Mike Florak, escorted by Dr. and Mrs. Edward Florak. Number 11, Tim Brake, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Brake. Number 12, Dave Walkowski. Number 85, Paul Walkowski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Walkowski. Number 13, Mike Kissinger, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Don Kissinger. Number 14, Paul Chapano, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Chapano. Number 14, Curtis Byrne, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Williams. Number 15, Pete Vodovich, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Pete Vodovich. Number 19, Ed Gaughan, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Roger Gaughan. Number 20, Fred DiDonato, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Fred DiDonato. Number 21, Lance Robson and cheerleader Lorraine Robson, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Gary Robson. Number 22, Mike Cerrone, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Angelo Cerrone. Number 23, Mike Allen, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Allen. Number 24, Bob Graziani, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Christy Graziani. Number 25, Bob Coslow, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Coslow. Number 29, Robert Bodigal, escorted by Victor and Dolores Bodigal. Number 29, Pat Coughlin, escorted by Mrs. John Coughlin. Number 30, Jim Valerio, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Valerio. Number 31, Paul DeBeasy, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Paul DeBeasy. Number 32, Todd Dugan, escorted by Mrs. Tom Dugan and brother Tom. Number 33, John DiCarlantonio, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Francisco DiCarlantonio. Number 34, Craig Brown, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Hubert Terry. Number 35, Dean DiBardino, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Raymond DiBardino. Number 40, Jamie Hartzell, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. James Hartzell. Number 41, Blaine Rogers, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Marion Rogers. Number 42, Joe Piro, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Piro. Number 43, Matt Levinsky, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Levinsky. Number 44, Eric Anlicker, escorted by Joan Anlicker. Number 45, John Sobolewski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Sobolewski. Number 45, Pat McLaughlin, escorted by Elsie and Gilbert McLaughlin. Number 50, Martin Zerini, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. George Zerini. Number 51, Danny DeLuca, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Patsy DeLuca. Number 52, John Gentile, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Gentile. Number 53, Jeff Clark, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Clark. Number 54, Don Napoli, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Mario Napoli. Number 55, Mike Phipps, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Phipps. Number 60, Andy Sposito, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Vince Sposito. Number 61, Dave Owens, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dave Owens. Number 62, Mike Gilson, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Gilson. Number 63, Vince Oliver, escorted by Mr. Vince Oliver and Mrs. Alice Oliver. Number 64, Frank Janamore, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Janamore. Number 65, Greg Kastner, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Carmen Kastner. Number 66, Ron Delator, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ron Delator. Number 67, Rich Shimilowski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Tom Shimilowski. Number 68, Anthony Swan, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. James Swan. Number 69, Joe McGuire, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Patrick McGuire. Number 70, Earl Marshall, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Earl Marshall. Number 71, Bob Palumbo, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Palumbo. Number 72, Paul Ignat, escorted by Joe Ignat and Paula Ignat. Number 73, Joe Colabella, escorted by Mrs. Frances Colabella. Number 74, Mark Taglione, escorted by Mrs. Barbara Taglione. Number 75, Mark Marchetta, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. James Marchetta. Number 77, Will Jenkins, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Will Jenkins. Number 78, Anthony Lamatreese, escorted by Mrs. Jean Lamatreese and Tony Marchione. Number 79, Mike Tripodi, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Vince Tripodi. Number 80, Mike Zito, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dominic Zeno. Number 81, Mike DeBeasy, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael DeBeasy. Number 82, Bob Erosovich, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Erosovich. Number 84, Mike Secun, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ernie Secun. Number 86, Carl Klonowski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ed Klonowski. Number 87, Todd Phillipson, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Phillipson. Number 88, Will Nankaville, escorted by Mrs. Jean Nankaville. Number 89, Greg Peters, escorted by Mrs. Rita Peters. The trainers and managers, Molly Marshall, Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Marshall. Lynn McAllister, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. James McAllister.
Hi. Yeah.
Kevin Feeney, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Tom Feeney. Bill Larniker, escorted by Mr. Bob Larniker. Keith Bodo, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dave and Phyllis Bodo. Jim Cavanaugh, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Cavanaugh. Varsity cheerleaders, Stacy Anastasia, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Anastasio. Dina DiCarlo, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John DiCarlo. Adrian Delator, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Richard Delator. Sandra Antonin, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Antonin. Monica Champano, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dominic Champano.